We live in a world of waste. Just think about it. We waste time, we waste resources, we waste a lot of things in our lives that we don't really need, but yet they're part of our lives. And if you look at where you put your time last week and where that time went, and think of it in buckets. What were the buckets that you created? And how many of those buckets would you now look back and go, that was waste? I think we create a lot of waste. In fact, at one of the companies I worked for, they measured this for quite a while, over about 20 years. And they measured the effectiveness of people. And one of the things they found is most humans are engaged in 30 to 50% of their time is spent on things that produce nothing. And then what we refer to as waste. So imagine that, 30%, 50% of your time is spent on things that aren't effective, they're not producing anything, they're just taking up your time. So now as you think about that, it's easy to look back on that and go, well, yeah, it's not really my fault. You see, I had to sit in that meeting for 2.5 hours because the boss called the meeting and, well, what am I supposed to say to my boss? No, I'm not coming to your meeting, even though I know that I sat there for 2.5 hours and I provided no value whatsoever. See, a lot of us do things like that. We look at the time, we look at our waste, and we become what I call victims. It's funny, I've used this, a friend of mine taught me this, and so as I go through life and I'm talking with somebody and they start explaining their life to me, and they start going down this rabbit hole that I'm not accountable, I'm not responsible, I just slowly bring this little V up to my forehead, and then they stop and like, what are you doing? I'm like, well, it sounds like you're a big victim right now. Aren't there things that you could do, that you could take control of? And so when we talk about emotional intelligence now, today we're going to really hone in on a second key component of emotional intelligence, which is what we call self-management. When we talk about self-management, there's 5 key areas that we want to be aware of and be able to work on to increase our ability to manage self. On the slide, you'll see what these 5 areas are. Self-control, trustworthiness, conscientiousness, adaptability, and innovativeness. We talk about self-control, it's I sense the state of internal or external stimuli that influences thoughts, emotions, and behavior. I maintain an awareness of personal reaction patterns. I plan effective countermeasures to internal and external stimuli. I implement effective countermeasures to internal and external stimuli. And I think and act clearly and consistently under pressure. So we know what self-control is, but let me give you an example of what it looks like as I'm trying to gain more self-control and gain greater emotional intelligence. About 30 years ago, maybe even 35 years ago, coming up on my 40th anniversary, me and my wife had this little, we called it a video that we played. That she would do something or say something, and then I would react a certain way, which would then cause her to react a certain way. And it was just this video that would play out, and sometimes it would last for a month, sometimes it would last for a week, but very rarely did it last for just a very limited period of time, because these videos would play out and I would say things that I really didn't mean, but I was reacting in the moment. She would say things that maybe she didn't really mean, and then she would get hurt or I would get frustrated, and we just had this video that played out, and it always started the same way and pretty much always ended the same way. And then one day we sat down and we started realizing that this video isn't helping us at all. And I was on my journey of really trying to be a better husband. And so I chose to start to do some and behave differently in these. And one of the things that I recognized is that I started to look for what were the key elements that kicked this video off. What was the moment? What was the things that were said? Or what was the experience that took place that all of a sudden would then flip me into my part of the video? Once I identified what those were, I started looking for them. And it was funny because as soon as I would identify that was happening, my countermeasure that I put in place is that I just needed to remove myself. Because if I stayed there in the moment, inevitably I would always say something that I would regret later. So I found for me, my countermeasure was to leave. Well, what was interesting is that my wife would then look at that countermeasure as I was trying to run away from the conversation or run away from the problem. And I tried to explain, it's like, no, if I stay here, you and I both know I'm going to say something that's stupid, and then you're not going to forget about it for about 10 years, and this isn't going to go in a good place. So I'd try to go away, and I'd go into the other room. And then she would follow me into the other room. And I'm like, what can we do? And so I just kept looking at what other countermeasures. I finally, for a period of time, I honestly had to just leave the house, get in my car, and drive away. And it caused some really angry frustration on my wife's part initially, but I just knew that if I stayed, it wouldn't. So I disrupted the video by leaving. So that was my countermeasure. As time went on, I was able to move and progress from as soon as I identified it, I could stop and I could pause. I could make some kind of a positive comment or a reference to where we're going, and if we continue down this road, is there a way we could talk about it differently? And then sometimes it would spiral and I would end up leaving and have to disengage, but I eventually had to not drive away. I could just go to a different room, or sometimes I could just stop talking until I could come back and we could have a better conversation. I can tell you today, after 40 years, we worked on that for years, of just that specific little emotions that drove our behaviors and that were having a negative impact on our relationship. Both of us, we found countermeasures that we could talk about, we shared, and that we were able to implement. And so now when a problem comes up, which they still do, even after 40 years of marriage, we still have conflicts. We just finished building a house. Try to get through building a house without having any conflicts, right? But I can tell you that we can resolve the conflict now within minutes, where it used to take months and even years in our earlier marriage. So this is one of those key things when we talk about self-control. It's the ability that I have to control those emotions, and when I can't, what countermeasures can I put in place to be able to ensure that I can manage those emotions in a way that's more appropriate and get better results in my relationships. So we'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel here and stay tuned for more videos like this one and stories that I can share with you about how to become more effective and gain greater emotional intelligence that can impact personal and professional relationships in your lives. And as we do that, you can join us on our mission at putting the human back into humanity.